The morning sun rose slowly over Arroyo Verde, a forgotten town tucked deep into the New Mexico desert. It was May 14th, 1975. Warm, still, and quiet, in the way only small towns can be. The kind of place where the days blended together, where time moved gently, and where nothing truly unexpected ever seemed to happen. By 7 a.m., the desert sky was already glowing a pale gold. Heat shimmered above the dry earth, and a thin breeze pushed dust through the narrow streets. The town was waking up the same way it always did, slow, familiar, predictable. On the corner of Balboa Street stood Arroyo Verde Elementary, a squat beige building surrounded by a stretch of cracked asphalt, a few struggling trees, and a chain-link fence that rattled in the wind. The playground behind the school was simple: a pair of metal swings, a faded slide, a set of monkey bars hot enough to burn small hands by noon, and a sandbox where generations of children had built crooked castles. For the children of Arroyo Verde, this playground was their universe. At 7:45 a.m., cars rolled up one by one, dropping off students with lunchboxes, backpacks, and sleepy eyes. Teachers stood by the front doors, greeting each child by name. Among the tiny stream of students was 5-year-old Clara Perez. Clara was small, light on her feet, and always slightly behind the rest of the world, as though she took her time moving through it, noticing things no one else saw. That morning she wore a simple white dress patterned with tiny blue flowers. Her mother had tied a bright red ribbon into her hair before school, a splash of color that stood out against the pale morning light. Clara walked toward the building with small measured steps, holding the strap of her backpack with both hands. A dust cloud drifted across the playground, swirling around her like the desert itself was awake and moving. Inside the school, the hallways filled with chatter, teachers prepared for the day. The scent of chalk and warm paper floated through the air. Morning lessons began, and the hours slipped by untouched, ordinary, quiet. Nothing hinted at what was coming. At 10:30 a.m., the bell rang for morning recess. A burst of sound filled the hallway, chairs scraping, children cheering, a wave of footsteps pounding toward the playground. Clara slipped into the crowd, her red ribbon bouncing behind her as she followed the other children outside. The playground hummed with life. Kids raced toward the swings, climbed the monkey bars, chased each other around the sandbox. Dust rose from the ground with every step, floating under the sun like golden sparks. Clara stayed close to the swings. She traced lines in the sand with the toe of her shoe, humming a tune only she seemed to know. She liked the quiet corners of the playground, the edges where the fence met the dry grass. She liked watching clouds drift over the desert, turning from white to silver as they crossed the sky. For the teachers on duty, it was a normal morning, the kind they'd seen 1,000 times. But small details matter. A teacher later remembered seeing a white pickup truck parked behind the school, a spot where vehicles rarely stopped. Another recalled a man in a faded cap standing far off near the dirt road, too distant to be suspicious, too close to ignore entirely. A student said he saw someone talking to Clara, though he couldn't describe who. At the time, none of it stood out. At 10:32 a.m., Clara wandered closer to the fence. She pressed her hands against the cool metal links and looked outward, toward the empty road, the wide desert, the endless horizon. Something out there seemed to catch her attention, something the other children didn't see. She stepped away from the swings. No one noticed. Children ran, laughed, shouted, climbed, jumped. A dozen small dramas played out across the playground, each one loud enough to drown out the sound of the quietest child stepping into the wrong place at the wrong moment. At 10:35 a.m., Clara was seen near the far corner of the fence, where the metal bent slightly inward from years of desert wind. She stood still, facing outward, hair moving gently in the breeze. At 10:37 a.m., a teacher blew a whistle, calling a small group of children away from the monkey bars. She scanned the yard, counting heads, scanning faces, scanning bodies in motion. Everything seemed normal. But Clara was no longer by the fence. She was no longer by the swings. She was nowhere. At 10:39 a.m., a child asked another where Clara went. No one knew. They shrugged, kept playing, kept running, kept screaming under the desert sun. At 10:43 a.m., the bell rang. Children lined up at the double doors. Dust swirled around their shoes. Teachers counted out loud, stepping through their routines without hesitation. One by one, each child stepped inside, except Clara. Her empty place in line was small, easy to miss, hidden between noise and routine. But when her teacher counted the second time, the number didn't match. She scanned the faces. She scanned the line. She scanned the swings, the slide, the monkey bars. The playground looked the same as it always had, but it felt different. The air suddenly heavy. Still, too quiet. Something was wrong. The teacher stepped outside, called Clara's name once, then again, then louder. Her voice cut through the playground like a blade. No answer. She searched behind the swings, behind the slide, behind the cluster of scraggly desert trees near the fence. Nothing. The other teachers joined in, quick steps, sharp voices, scanning where a 5-year-old might hide. Still nothing. Time stretched. A clock on the classroom wall ticked. Children waited inside, confused, wide-eyed. By 10:51 a.m., the school secretary was on the phone with the sheriff's department. A small voice inside the front office whispered the one sentence no school ever wants to hear. A student is missing. Teachers researched the playground, the bathrooms, every classroom. They checked closets, hallways, the cafeteria. They checked under tables, behind doors, anywhere a scared or playful child might hide. Clara was not hiding. The school locked its front doors. Staff began sweeping the perimeter. And then, at 10:58 a.m., a teacher found something, a bright red ribbon, Clara's ribbon, lying in the sand at the far corner of the playground, placed neatly beside the fence, as if someone had set it down with care. Not dropped, not torn, placed. The desert wind picked up, rattling the chain-link fence, carrying a low, eerie whistle across the playground. This was the moment the quiet school day cracked open. This was the moment innocence evaporated. This was the moment everything changed. Clara Perez was gone. Gone without a scream. Gone without a trace. Gone in a place where nothing dangerous was supposed to happen. And no one in Arroyo Verde, on that warm, golden morning, had any idea that this disappearance would grow into one of the most haunting, relentless cold cases in New Mexico history. A mystery that would take nearly 5 decades to unravel. And the truth was darker than anyone had imagined. The moment the red ribbon was found, everything inside Arroyo Verde Elementary shifted from routine to crisis. A tension thickened in the air, as if the desert itself sensed what the humans had not yet fully understood. A child was missing. At 11:02 a.m., the school's principal initiated the emergency protocol. Teachers moved quickly through the hallways, shutting classroom doors, gathering students into groups, instructing them to sit close, stay calm, and stay quiet. None of the children understood why the adults' faces had changed, why their voices had lowered, why they kept glancing toward the playground through narrow windows. The sheriff's department dispatched their first unit within minutes. Patrol cars tore down the dusty main road, sirens silent but lights flashing, kicking clouds of dirt into the air. In a town as small as Arroyo Verde, everyone saw when law enforcement moved fast. Doors opened, faces appeared on porches. Mothers pulled children indoors. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. By 11:10 a.m., deputies were inside the school, walking the hallways in sharp, purposeful strides. The principal led them to the playground, pointing toward the far fence where the ribbon had been discovered. One deputy knelt in the sand, studying the small red bow that had once been tied neatly into Clara's hair. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The sight alone was enough. Something terrible had happened here. More officers arrived. They spread across the playground in a methodical pattern, examining every inch of ground. The desert offered little to read. No footprints, no drag marks, no broken branches, no disturbed sand. It was as if Clara had simply vanished. At 11:17 a.m., the search expanded outward. Deputies began combing the perimeter behind the school, an open stretch of hard-packed dirt, thin grass, and sun-scorched shrubs. A chain-link fence separated the playground from a narrow service road, rarely used, mostly forgotten, and now ominously significant. They scanned the fence for signs of tampering. Nothing. No bent wires, no broken ties, no gaps big enough for a child to slip through. And yet, the ribbon lay right there, just inches from the metal links, too close to ignore, too deliberate to dismiss. They began calling Clara's name into the desert. Her name echoed, soft, brittle, fading quickly into the wide, empty landscape. Nothing answered back. At 11:30 a.m., more deputies arrived, followed by volunteers from the surrounding neighborhoods. Some still wore aprons from restaurant kitchens. Others carried tools from job sites. Some wore school ID badges around their necks. No one cared about the heat or the dust or the abruptness of it all. There was a missing child, and in a town like Arroyo Verde, that meant everyone searched. The group formed a line and swept across the desert floor, shoulder to shoulder, moving slowly, methodically. They checked behind bushes, beneath rusted water tanks, along the old drainage ditch that ran parallel to the school. They searched the storage sheds, the maintenance yard, and the back alleys behind nearby houses. Still nothing. At noon, the sheriff called in reinforcements. The day had grown hotter, harsher, the kind of heat that shimmered off the ground and blurred the horizon. Sweat dripped down faces, throats dried. But no one stopped. At 12:25 p.m., the first helicopter arrived from the county seat. It circled the area, blades chopping the dry desert air, scanning the terrain with trained eyes. From above, the land stretched wide and unforgiving. Acres of sun-bleached earth, scattered rocks, and brittle vegetation. A landscape that could easily swallow a small child. On the ground, deputies examined tire tracks near the service road. Most were old, faded impressions left by maintenance workers or local traffic. But one set of tracks looked newer, fresher, still sharply cut into the dirt. They measured the tread, noted the width, and exchanged glances. The pattern looked like it belonged to a pickup truck, a white pickup truck. The same kind of vehicle a teacher had noticed earlier that morning. But the tracks led away from the school, toward the desert highway, and there was no telling how long they had been there, or who they belonged to. At 1:15 p.m., officers expanded the search radius to half a mile. Volunteers fanned out farther, pushing through cactus patches and brittle ground. The wind picked up, hot and biting, blowing sand across the searchers' ankles. Every few minutes, someone paused, listening, hoping for a child's cry carried across the desert. But the desert offered only silence. Back at the school, a deputy searched Clara's cubby and found her morning drawings: a sun, a house, a crooked flower. Crayon marks pressed hard into the paper. The drawings looked so normal, so small, so painfully ordinary. Evidence of a child who should have been laughing at recess, not missing somewhere in the desert. By mid-afternoon, the search had grown massive. Ranchers on horseback combed remote areas. Local farmers brought out ATVs. A neighboring town sent additional officers. The heat climbed to nearly 90 degrees, and the sunlight took on a sharp, unforgiving glare. Still no Clara. Still no clothing. Still no clues. At 3:40 p.m., the searchers reached the dried riverbed, wide, cracked, and silent. They scanned the banks, checked beneath low-hanging brush, stepped carefully around loose stones. A child could have wandered here. A child could have hidden here. But Clara had not been here. The riverbed was empty. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the tone of the search changed. The urgency remained, but the hope began to thin. Conversations grew quieter. Footsteps slowed. People looked more often toward the sheriff, toward the school, toward each other, as if searching for permission to believe the unthinkable. At 5:00 p.m., after nearly 6 hours of searching, the sheriff called his deputies together. His expression was heavy, lined with exhaustion and something darker, something close to dread. They had covered miles of terrain. They had searched every inch of the school grounds. They had questioned teachers, students, maintenance workers, bus drivers, and nothing, absolutely nothing, pointed to Clara still being near the school. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Clara Perez had not wandered away. Clara Perez had been taken. Somewhere out there, beyond the fences in the desert heat, someone had left with her. Someone who moved quietly. Someone who left no tracks. Someone who knew how to vanish into the landscape. As the sun began to sink behind the red New Mexico mosses, the search continued into the evening. Flashlights appeared. Dust rose. Voices echoed into the dimming sky. But the desert was silent. Clara was gone. And the mystery of her disappearance was only just beginning. The first night without Clara settled over Arroyo Verde like a heavy blanket. Thick, unmoving, suffocating. When the sun finally dipped beneath the jagged New Mexico mesas, darkness spread quickly across the desert, swallowing the town in silence. But the search did not stop. Flashlights carved thin tunnels through the night. Volunteers moved in slow lines, their shadows stretching across the sand. Deputies called Clara's name until their voices cracked, their words dissolving into the rising desert wind. Every hour, more people joined. Some came straight from work, still in dusty boots or flour-stained aprons. Others arrived clutching jackets, blankets, and thermoses of coffee. No one wanted to sleep. No one could sleep. A missing child had a way of pulling a community together and hollowing it out at the same time. Inside the school, officers set up a temporary command center. Maps covered tables, marked with circles, showing where search teams had already combed the ground. Radios crackled with updates, each one shorter, more strained than the last. Nothing found, No signs, no movement, no Clara. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped sharply. The desert, which blistered under daylight, became cold and unforgiving at night. Searchers wrapped themselves in jackets, their breath forming pale clouds each time they exhaled. They kept searching anyway. At 2:14 a.m., deputies discovered a piece of fabric snagged on a mesquite branch near the service road. For one terrifying, hopeful second, they thought it belonged to Clara. But under flashlight beams, the truth emerged. It was just a fragment of someone's old work shirt, torn, sun-bleached, useless. False hope would become a cruel companion in this case. By dawn, the search entered its 12th hour. The sheriff made the decision no one wanted to hear. The FBI was being called in. Word spread quickly. Shop doors opened early. Residents stepped outside before the sun fully rose, gathering in small clusters, whispering in worried tones. Everyone seemed to know the same truth. Children did not simply disappear from schoolyards, not without help, not without intent. At 7:30 a.m., federal agents arrived. Their vehicles kicked clouds of dust into the air as they pulled into the school parking lot. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere, more official, more rigid, more grim. They studied the playground, the red ribbon, the dirt road, the faint tire tracks that might have belonged to someone, or no one at all. They noted how the scene seemed too clean, too quiet, too deliberate. By 9 a.m., the FBI expanded the search radius to 2 miles. Teams scoured the outskirts of town, dilapidated barns, empty fields, abandoned trailers where dust covered everything in a thick, unmoving layer. They checked irrigation pipes, storm drains, ditches, and culverts. Every shadow became a possibility. Every hole became a threat. But with each new sweep, the same emptiness greeted them. Meanwhile, deputies continued to interview anyone who might have seen something, anything, unusual the day before. A teacher recalled the white pickup near the fence. A student vaguely remembered a man standing by the service road. A janitor noted that a maintenance gate had been left open earlier than usual. But memories were loose threads, slipping away when they were needed most. By the afternoon of the second day, the investigation took a turn. A rancher reported seeing dust swirl unnaturally on the old highway north of town, too concentrated, too sudden, as if a vehicle had sped through not long after recess ended. It was a thin lead, nearly useless in isolation. But when agents plotted the tire tracks found behind the school, the pattern aligned. Someone had left fast. Someone had taken the service road. Someone drove toward the old highway. It was the first hint of a direction, north. But north of Arroyo Verde lay nothing but open land, miles of flat desert, a few scattered ranches, a stretch of mesas jagged like broken teeth. And beyond that, more emptiness. Still, search teams followed the lead. Hours passed. Hope faded. The desert, vast and pitiless, offered no clues. Inside the school, fatigue carved deep lines into the faces of every officer. Papers piled on desks. Coffee cups littered tables. A chalkboard listed the areas searched, each section crossed out with thick black lines. One deputy quietly marked the time. Clara had been missing for 24 hours. At this point, statistics became cold enemies. Survival rates dropped sharply after the first day, even steeper after 2. Everyone in the command center knew it. No one said it out loud. Instead, they pushed harder. By the second night, the search became slower, heavier, more methodical. The once loud voices faded into hoarse murmurs. Volunteers limped from exhaustion. the sheriff forced several to go home, though many returned at dawn. At 10:18 p.m., a K-9 unit caught a faint scent near the edge of a dried arroyo. Hearts raced, lights flashed, dozens rushed to the area. But the scent ended abruptly, right at the edge of the dirt road. A small child could not simply stop leaving scent. Not unless they were lifted, carried, placed into a vehicle. The pattern grew clearer, sharper, more chilling. This was not a wandering child. This was not an accident. This was an abduction. At 3:00 a.m., the FBI concluded that Clara had likely been taken within the first minutes of recess. The pickup truck sighting was reclassified as a critical lead. Roadblocks were ordered on every route leading in and out of town. Too late. Too many hours had already passed. By dawn of the second day, nearly 36 hours into the search, the reality began to take shape, like a shadow forming under the rising sun. Whoever took Clara knew the area well. Whoever took Clara moved quietly. Whoever took Clara had vanished into the desert with her, without leaving a trail. And now, as the first 48 hours closed, a new question began to weave its way into every investigator's thoughts. Was Clara still alive? No one said it. No one had to. The first 48 hours had ended without a single solid clue, and the long, painful descent into mystery had only just begun. By the third day, Arroyo Verde no longer felt like a town. It felt like a wound, raw, exposed, and pulsing with fear. Every conversation circled back to the same question: who took Clara Perez? While volunteers continued searching, investigators shifted focus from the desert to the people who had been near the school the day Clara vanished. Patterns were forming, small, fragile pieces that didn't yet fit, but pointed toward a shape emerging beneath the surface. The FBI began by re-examining the white truck sighting. The teacher who mentioned it couldn't recall the license plate, only that she had never seen the vehicle near the school before. It had been parked at an angle half concealed by the fence line, as if the driver wanted to watch without being watched. Agents pulled school records, maintenance rosters, delivery logs. No official vehicles matched the description. No workers were scheduled near the playground. No one had permission to park there at all. The white pickup became more than a suspicious detail. It became the first real threat. The second lead came from a construction worker who had been repairing a roof across the street. On the day of the disappearance, he saw a man standing far off near the service road, motionless, hands inside his pockets, eyes fixed towards the playground. The worker couldn't describe much. The man wore a faded cap, jeans, and a shirt dusty from the desert wind. It was the kind of outfit every third person in Arroyo Verde owned. But something about him felt wrong. Something about him felt placed. As investigators mapped out the sightings, a chilling possibility surfaced. The white truck and the unknown man might be connected. Both had been positioned where the playground was visible. Both had appeared only on that specific morning. Both had vanished without a trace. Agents expanded their search to nearby towns. They questioned mechanics, gas station attendants, motel clerks, and ranch hands. Anyone who might have seen a stranger in a white truck. Most said no. Some weren't sure. One person mentioned a thin man wandering through town a week earlier, asking about schools in the area. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect, but it was enough to deepen the dread. Meanwhile, the FBI returned to the school grounds. They studied the layout, the timing, the distance from the playground fence to the service road. The more they walked the path Clara likely took, the clearer the truth became. Someone had been waiting. Someone had watched. Someone had known exactly when recess began. A spontaneous abduction was unlikely. This felt rehearsed. By noon, investigators widened the scope further, looking into transient workers, seasonal laborers, and drifters passing through the desert on foot or by truck. The 1970s were a volatile time in the American Southwest. High mobility, loose job markets, and few identification requirements. Records were thin, inconsistently kept, sometimes non-existent. It became possible, terrifyingly possible, that the person responsible wasn't from Arroyo Verde at all. Still, a handful of residents lingered in the investigators' minds. One was a maintenance worker who had been near the school earlier that week, repairing a ventilation unit. His time card showed he wasn't scheduled the day Clara disappeared. But his absence didn't prove anything. He owned tools. He knew the layout. He occasionally parked his truck behind the school. But his truck was blue, not white. His build didn't match. His alibi held. Investigators set him aside. The second possible suspect was a ranch hand known for wandering town aimlessly when he drank. He wore old clothes, sometimes a faded cap, and liked watching people pass by from the roadside. But he had no vehicle, and multiple witnesses saw him miles away that morning. He, too, was eliminated. The third potential suspect, a young man who delivered milk to the school cafeteria, became a focus for half a day. His delivery logs were inconsistent, but his route manager confirmed he hadn't been near Arroyo Verde that week. Strike three. The investigation began to feel like chasing shadows. Every possible figure slipped through the cracks, leaving nothing solid to grasp. Leads evaporated as quickly as they formed. Witnesses contradicted each other. The desert swallowed time. Still, investigators pressed on. By the afternoon of the third day, they returned to the service road behind the school. The dirt surface held few secrets. Wind and footsteps had erased much of what might have existed. But faint impressions remained. Tire tracks, boot prints, the kind of subtle signs only visible to trained eyes. Agents marked them, photographed them, traced them. The tire tracks were clearer, a vehicle with older treads, wider wheel spacing than modern models, possibly a Ford pickup, possibly white. The boot prints were faint but deliberate. They suggested a person who had walked the area multiple times, someone who had positioned themselves with purpose, not simply wandered through. The picture forming in the investigators' minds was unsettling. This was not a moment of impulse. This was a plan. Word spread through Arroyo Verde by dusk. Parents held their children closer. Some kept them home from school. Others refused to let them play outside. The everyday rhythm of town life slowed to a crawl. People looked out windows twice before stepping outside once. Fear had settled into the bones of the community. By evening, agents attempted to reconstruct the timeline one final time. They moved hour by hour, minute by minute, tracing Clara's steps from the moment she entered the playground to the moment she vanished. The conclusion was simple and chilling. Whoever took Clara spent time near that fence. Whoever took Clara knew the recess schedule. Whoever took Clara moved fast, within seconds, not minutes. And whoever took Clara did so without drawing a single scream. Only someone confident, prepared, and practiced could do that. Only someone who had done something like this before. As the second night settled over the desert, the unknown man remained just that, unknown. a ghost in the shape of a human, a shadow that the desert seemed willing to keep. But the case was far from over, because even shadows leave traces. And the one pulled from the edges of the playground was about to lead investigators much closer to the truth, closer than anyone dared imagine. As the days passed, the investigation into Clara Perez's disappearance began to shift from frantic energy to a heavy, grinding exhaustion. The search for Clara lasted through scorching daylight and freezing desert nights. The schoolyard had been combed, the service road inspected, abandoned structures searched, and miles of desert crossed. But the truth remained painfully unchanged. No Clara, no clues, no answers. On the fifth day, the sheriff's department held their first formal briefing. Maps were unrolled across long wooden tables. Strings marked routes. Colored pins stabbed into locations already searched. There was an uncomfortable pattern forming, an emptiness so complete it felt deliberate. Everywhere they looked, Clara wasn't. By now, the town was no longer functioning normally. People spoke in hushed tones at grocery stores. Children were kept indoors. Schools taught half-empty classrooms. Restaurants stood quiet, as if joy itself had been suspended. The desert sun still rose each morning, but it seemed dimmer, paler, as if even the sky were grieving. Investigators continued their rounds of interviews. They returned to teachers, lunch staff, custodians, parents, passing motorists, anyone who might have seen or heard something. But memories were unreliable. Details blurred. Faces blended together. And the man near the service road became more myth than fact, a figure distorted by fear and speculation. Leads trickled in from across the county. A farmer thought he saw a girl walking along a distant ridge. False. A traveler claimed he saw a child matching Clara's description at a gas station. No proof, no video, no witnesses. A stray piece of fabric turned up near an irrigation canal. Weathered, old, unrelated. Every tip met the same dead end. By the seventh day, volunteers began slowing. People still cared, still showed up, but the raw panic had settled into a quieter, more desperate ache. They searched because not searching felt like giving up. They combed the desert, not because they expected to find Clara, but because they couldn't bear the guilt of staying home. Clara's disappearance began to spread beyond Arroyo Verde. Newspapers printed her photo. Radio stations repeated the same plea. A 5-year-old girl missing from her schoolyard. But with each day that passed, the trail grew colder, the likelihood of a rescue more distant. The FBI broadened its investigation. They looked into drifters, parolees, transient workers. They requested records from neighboring states. They checked pawn shops, truck stops, motels, anywhere a child's belongings or presence might surface. Nothing surfaced. Detectives followed the white truck lead with obsessive determination. They traced registrations, investigated owners, inspected vehicles, and cross-checked plates. But hundreds of similar trucks existed across the region, and each one narrowed into the same emptiness. Alibis, wrong dates, no connection. They searched the desert for tire tracks again. But wind erased what little had existed. Sand washed everything clean. The desert was a perfect accomplice. Weeks turned to a month. The school reopened its playground, but it didn't feel the same. Children approached the swing set cautiously. Teachers watched the perimeter with a vigilance that bordered on paranoia. The space where Clara had last been seen became a silent, sacred spot. Untouched, avoided, whispered about. The sheriff's department, once buzzing with urgency, now felt like a room filled with ghosts. Maps remained pinned to walls. The red ribbon sat sealed in an evidence bag. Case notes piled up. Coffees went cold. Hope stretched thin. Every attempt to reconstruct Clara's final moments led to the same impossibility. A child disappearing without noise, without struggle, without trace. Eventually, investigators began to confront a chilling possibility that whoever took Clara had done so cleanly, methodically, and with experience. If the unknown man had taken her, he had done it before. If the driver of the white truck was involved, he had pre-planned the route. If someone from town was responsible, they were hiding in plain sight. But there was no proof, no pattern, only theories woven from thin air. By the second month, the case had shifted from active search to investigative maintenance. Deputies still patrolled the outskirts. Detectives checked old leads every week. The FBI monitored for any movement, any rumor, any sighting. But nothing came. Life in Arroyo Verde drifted back into routine, though never fully. The shadow of that day remained etched into every hallway, every playground, every morning bell. Parents kept their children close, eyes sharper than before. The trust the town once shared had fractured into something brittle. Clara's family held on to hope longer than most. They kept her room untouched, her drawings pinned to the wall, her toys lined neatly, as they had been on the morning she left for school. A small candle burned every night by the window. Some nights they left it on until dawn. But even hope has limits. After 6 months, with no new tips, no sightings, no breakthroughs, the inevitable happened. The case was officially declared cold. The maps came down. Search teams disbanded. Files were boxed. Evidence stored. Computers closed. The red ribbon, the only physical piece of Clara that had ever been recovered, remained in a sealed envelope, tucked inside an aging evidence drawer, where it would sit untouched for nearly 50 years. Arroyo Verde tried to move on, but the truth was simple. A part of the town disappeared with Clara, and for nearly half a century, the mystery of what happened to her remained locked away in silence, waiting for the one discovery, decades later, that would finally shatter the darkness and bring the truth to light. For almost 5 decades, the file labeled Perez, Clara, missing child, 1975 sat untouched in a storage room inside the New Mexico Cold Case archive. A thin layer of dust settled on the cardboard edges. The ink on the label had faded from black to gray. The red ribbon inside, once vibrant, once tied neatly in a little girl's hair, had lost its color, dulled by time and silence. Generations of detectives had glanced at the file, shaken their heads, and moved on to cases that had evidence, leads, or hope. But Clara's case, it held none of those things. It was a story buried in desert sand, sealed by decades of unanswered questions. Until 2023, the state received federal funding for a sweeping review of cold cases involving children. Boxes were pulled from storage, cataloged, and brought into the light for the first time in years. Technology had evolved dramatically since 1975. Methods that were once impossible were now standard. Evidence once considered useless had become potential gold. Clara's file was assigned to a small team inside the cold case unit. At first, they treated it like any other case. Reading old statements, timelines, letters from the family, photographs of the playground, sketches of tire tracks that meant nothing anymore. And then they found the envelope, thin, fragile, labeled only as recovered item, playground. Inside was the red ribbon, the same ribbon found at the edge of the playground fence on the day Clara vanished. A piece of evidence ignored for decades because in 1975, no one considered it useful. No fingerprints, no fiber testing, no forensic power. But in 2023, it became something else entirely, a possibility. The team submitted the ribbon to the state forensic lab, expecting nothing. Cases this old rarely yielded miracles. Time eroded everything: skin cells, hair, fibers, hope. But modern labs had techniques that pushed the limits of science. And so, the ribbon was tested. Weeks passed. The cold case team moved on to other files. More DNA submissions, more old envelopes, more fragile evidence from forgotten tragedies. And then one morning, the call came in. A lab technician, voice steady, but charged with something electric, told the supervisor they had found DNA on the knot of the ribbon. It was partial, broken, faint, but it was real. Microscopic biological material trapped in the fibers where the ribbon had been tied. Enough to build a profile, enough to run through modern genealogical databases, enough to wake a case that had slept for nearly half a century. The process began quietly. No press releases, no announcements, just silent hope humming somewhere deep inside the investigation room. The DNA profile was uploaded. The waiting began. Matches trickled in, distant relatives, partial connections, nothing definitive. But then, the impossible happened. A branch on the genealogical map lit up. A match strong enough to trace to a single family. A family with ties to Arroyo Verde in the 1970s. A family with a name investigators had never seen in the original case file. The match belonged to the grandson of Raymond Holt. The moment investigators saw the name, an eerie stillness filled the room. Holt, a handyman, a drifter, a man who lived 3 blocks from Arroyo Verde Elementary in 1975. A man who had worked odd jobs for half the town. A man who had been alive during the disappearance, but dead since 1993. A man who, for reasons no one could explain, had never been interviewed, never questioned, never suspected, never connected, until now. Investigators dug into his background with careful, methodical precision. His old addresses, his employment records, his police reports, his movements during the spring of 1975. What they found was unsettling. Holt had a history of wandering near public places, parks, schools, playgrounds. He was described by neighbors as quiet, odd, distant, and overly interested in children. He'd been reported twice for loitering near school fences, though both reports were dismissed as harmless. He owned a white Ford pickup in the 1970s, the same kind of truck seen near the playground the morning Clara disappeared. A truck he sold months later, a truck never traced, a truck that vanished into the desert, just like Clara had. As the team cross-referenced his timeline, an eerie picture formed. Holt had been off work on the morning of May 14th. He lived alone. He had no alibi. And his property, an old rented storage shed near the outskirts of town, had never been searched. A judge approved a search warrant. The shed had been untouched for decades, abandoned after Holt's death. Its wooden door sagged. The desert wind moaned through cracks in its walls. Inside, dust clung to old workbenches, rusted tools, and stacks of forgotten junk. Investigators sifted slowly, carefully. Then one of them found it. A small metal button, blue, round, with faint white stitching, matching the pattern of the dress Clara wore that day. Nearby lay a scrap of faded notebook paper with a child's doodles, crooked flowers, shaky lines, a sun drawn in the corner. They found soil samples on the floor that, when tested, matched the dried riverbed area searched in 1975. Piece by piece, the past began to speak. Piece by piece, the truth crept out from where it had been waiting, buried beneath dust, darkness, and time. The DNA wasn't a mistake. The ribbon wasn't random. The man wasn't innocent. Raymond Holt had been there that morning. Holt had been near the fence. Holt had been watching. And with that discovery, the cold case team realized something chilling. They weren't reopening the case anymore. They were solving it. When the DNA match pointed squarely at Raymond Holt, investigators felt something they hadn't felt in decades of reviewing Clara's case. Momentum. The kind of momentum that comes when a locked door finally begins to shift, when a mystery sealed in dust starts cracking open. The name sat heavy in the air. Raymond Holt. To anyone outside Arroyo Verde, he was a stranger. But to the cold case unit, he became the central figure of a puzzle that had defied generations. Everything they found in the shed, the button, the doodles, the soil, wasn't proof by itself. But together, they created a haunting outline. Now investigators needed the details. They needed to understand who Holt was in 1975, where he lived, where he worked, what he knew, and how close he truly was to Clara. They started with the basics, pulling his old records, tracing his life backward, like following footprints in the sand. Holt had been born in 1938, raised in a tiny farming community just 20 miles north of Arroyo Verde. His early life was unremarkable. Odd jobs, periods of instability, moving from one temporary position to another. He never married. He had no children of his own, no criminal convictions beyond public intoxication and trespassing. But his proximity to children's spaces was unsettling. Neighbors reported he often lingered near parks. He spent hours wandering town, watching. He volunteered occasionally as a handyman for the local church. He frequently offered help to families in need, always friendly, always available, always close enough to seem harmless. In small towns, familiarity often replaces suspicion. People look past eccentricities. They assume the best. They trust, because trust is all they know. And Holt blended perfectly into that world. Investigators tracked his movements in 1975, building a map of his daily life. At the time of Clara's disappearance, Holt lived in a small, run-down home, less than a 15-minute walk from the school. He worked part-time repairing fences for a local rancher. His schedule shifted weekly, giving him ample opportunities to move unnoticed. And according to payroll records, he hadn't clocked in on the day Clara disappeared. He was unaccounted for during the exact window of time she vanished. As the cold case unit layered the timeline over Holt's history, the alignment became more precise, more chilling. He had access to a white truck, a beat-up Ford pickup he sold in late 1975. Investigators located the new owner's paperwork, but the vehicle had long been scrapped. Whatever secrets it held were lost to the desert. Still, clues continued surfacing. Holt owned a ring of keys, dozens of them, many unlabeled, mysterious. Investigators believed he had collected them over years of side jobs. But the unsettling truth hung in the air. Some keys may have opened sheds, storage units, or even gates near the school. Places where he could have waited. Places where he could have taken Clara. Places no one thought to look in 1975. As they reconstructed Holt's habits, investigators uncovered patterns. He walked the same desert roads again and again. He positioned himself near familiar routes. He frequented the service road behind the school, a shortcut to his home that most townspeople rarely used. It was the same service road where Clara's scent had ended, where tire tracks were found, where a white truck had been seen parked. The pieces were closing in around Holt like a tightening ring. But the most unsettling part of Holt's story came from his final years. Before his death, he rented a small property on the outskirts of town. Simple, isolated, surrounded by dry brush and mesquite trees. The interior had been stripped bare before investigators arrived decades later, but faint marks on the floor, old nails in the walls, and abandoned storage boxes suggested he had used the space regularly. Had Clara been there? Had she been kept there briefly? Had something happened there that erased her from the world? There was no clear answer, only shadows. Still, the shed discovery had shifted everything. The scribbles on the notebook paper, the childish designs, could not be ignored. They were too innocent, too specific, too out of place for a single man living alone. Investigators sent them for forensic aging. The ink matched mid-1970s chemistry. The lines matched a child's natural hand movements. The implication was horrifying. But the biggest revelation emerged from soil analysis. The dirt found on the shed floor was a match to the soil from a specific section of the dried riverbed east of town, an area where searchers had spent hours in 1975. An area that, in hindsight, the abductor might have used as a temporary stop, knowing footprints could vanish quickly under wind and shifting ground. Suddenly, Clara's last steps were no longer lost to time. They were reappearing, fragile but visible, through the evidence Holt had unknowingly left behind. Investigators pressed deeper into his life. They found complaints from neighbors about Holt wandering at night, reports of him staring at children on the playground fence years after Clara vanished. And most telling of all, a sheriff's deputy noted Holt once froze when questioned casually near the schoolyard in 1977. He walked away quickly, saying nothing. Guilt often reveals itself in silence. By the time the cold case unit finished reconstructing Holt's life, an eerie truth became undeniable. Holt had been circling Clara long before she disappeared. He had known the school's routine. He had known the recess schedule. He had known how quickly a child could vanish behind a fence. He had opportunity. He had motive. He had the means. And now, decades later, evidence finally tied him to the only object Clara left behind, the ribbon. The case was no longer a mystery. It was a timeline, broken in 1975, finally pieced together in 2023. Now, investigators needed one final layer, the reconstruction of what actually happened on that warm mornings in May. And what they uncovered next would bring the truth into full, devastating focus. After nearly 5 decades of silence, the truth behind Clara Perez's disappearance finally began to assemble itself, piece by fragile piece, into a coherent, chilling sequence. Investigators had Holt's DNA. They had his timeline. They had physical evidence from the shed. And they had witness accounts that, once scattered and faint, now aligned with unsettling precision. It was time to reconstruct what happened on the morning of May 14th, 1975. Not with guesswork, not with speculation, but with the cold, quiet certainty of evidence. The reconstruction began at the school, where investigators walked the playground. At the same time, Clara would have stepped outside. The desert sun rose just as it had on that day, bright, unobstructed, casting long shadows across the sand. The air held the same dry warmth. The wind whistled lightly through the chain-link fence. A place built for laughter, now haunted by memory. At 10:30 a.m., recess began, just as it had then. Children would have poured out the doors in a rush of excitement, their footsteps scattering across the playground. Teachers would have stood watch from a distance, scanning the yard, counting heads, reminding students to stay within the fenced area. And somewhere behind that fence, Holt was waiting. Based on the reconstruction, he likely arrived before recess began. It was not a chance encounter. Holt had chosen his moment carefully. He parked his white pickup truck along the secluded service road behind the school, out of sight from most staff, but close enough to the playground fence to watch every move. Investigators could see it clearly now. He stood there on the outer perimeter, hat pulled low, scanning the yard for the right moment. Not rushed, not panicked, prepared. He watched children play. He watched teachers turn away. He watched Clara. The evidence pointed to one painful truth. Holt targeted her. Maybe it was because she was small. Maybe because she wandered toward the fence. Maybe because she was quiet. Or maybe he had watched her before. But at 10:32 a.m., when Clara left the swings and walked toward the far corner of the playground, the corner closest to the service road, Holt made his move. Investigators believe he approached the fence quickly, silently, timing his steps with the wind and the noise of recess. Children shouting, chains creaking on the swings, footsteps running through sand. It was the perfect cover for someone who knew how to disappear into noise and emerge in silence. The red ribbon, found neatly placed near the fence, told its own story. Clara had stood close enough for Holt to reach. Close enough that her hair could have been touched. Close enough that a single motion, swift, practiced, could remove the ribbon without tearing it. The placement of the ribbon was deliberate. Investigators believe Holt placed it there to make the abduction appear accidental, to buy himself seconds, maybe minutes, before anyone realized she was gone. Seconds were all he needed. In the reconstruction, Holt reached through or over the fence, lifting Clara with shocking efficiency. She was small, light, easy to pick up with one arm. A child that young could have been lifted before she understood what was happening. No scream, no struggle, just confusion swallowed by the desert wind. He carried her to the service road, only a few steps away. The tire tracks discovered behind the school, faint but measurable, even decades later, revealed a sudden departure. The rear wheels had spun slightly, kicking dust backward, evidence of haste, but not panic. Holt placed Clara in the passenger seat, closed the door, and drove away. The entire abduction, from contact to escape, would have taken under 30 seconds. By the time teachers lined students up to return inside, Holt was already off the school grounds. By the time deputies arrived, he was miles away. By the time the search expanded, Clara was long gone. The question then became, where did he take her? The answer emerged from the soil samples found in Holt's shed, matching the dried riverbed east of town. According to the reconstruction, Holt likely drove Clara there first. It was secluded, quiet, shielded by brush, a place where someone could stop without being seen, even in broad daylight. The shed itself, however, suggested a second location. Investigators believed Holt only used the riverbed briefly, perhaps to transfer Clara, perhaps to hide, perhaps to decide his next move. The shed was different, isolated, hidden, abandoned even then. Inside, the presence of children's doodles hinted at a haunting possibility that Clara spent time there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. Investigators will never know. but the evidence was undeniable. And then the trail ended. For years, investigators wondered how Holt had managed to avoid suspicion. But now, the reconstruction revealed a chilling advantage. Holt lived alone, had no schedule, and could vanish for hours without anyone questioning him. He had the freedom to disappear. And he used it. The timeline, reconstructed with painful clarity, showed that Holt likely killed Clara the same day she was taken. The exact circumstances may never be known, but everything investigators uncovered, the shed, the riverbed, the items discovered, pointed toward a brief, tragic window in which Clara was alive and then gone. He disposed of her remains somewhere in the vast desert beyond Arroyo Verde, an area so enormous, so unforgiving, that locating a single body without direction would have been nearly impossible. With that, the reconstruction was complete. A silent abduction, a methodical escape, a fast calculated disappearance, all carried out by a man who had blended into the fabric of the town. A man who had watched Clara, followed Clara, prepared for Clara. Nearly 5 decades had passed since that day, but the truth, once fragmented and buried, had finally been pieced together. The story was no longer a mystery. It was a timeline that exposed the terrifying simplicity of the crime. A fence, a truck, a minute of opportunity, a lifetime of unanswered questions. Now investigators were ready for the final phase, telling the Perez family the truth they had lived half a century without. Nearly half a century after Clara Perez vanished from the playground of Arroyo Verde Elementary, her case file, once faded, forgotten, and buried beneath decades of dust, had finally taken shape. The truth had been reconstructed, the evidence aligned, and the name of the man responsible carved into the center of an investigation that had outlived almost everyone who worked it. The final step remained. The Perez family needed to know. The burden of delivering that truth weighed heavily on the cold case unit. It was one thing to solve a mystery on paper, to assemble the pieces in silence, guided by evidence and logic. It was something entirely different to place that truth into the hands of a family who had carried a void for nearly 50 years. The Perez family had dwindled over time. Clara's parents had passed away decades earlier, never knowing what happened to their little girl. Their grief had been a lifelong companion, quiet, constant, and heavy. But Clara's older relatives remained. A few cousins, an aunt, a younger sibling who had grown old without knowing the sister she barely remembered. They had lived with uncertainty for most of their lives. Now, that wait was ending. The family gathered in a quiet meeting room within the county justice building. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting narrow beams across the table. It was the same kind of light that had shone over Arroyo Verde the morning Clara vanished. Warm, bright, deceptively peaceful. The investigators entered with boxes of documents, maps, photographs, and the red ribbon sealed carefully in its plastic envelope. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as though the decades of silence that surrounded Clara's case had followed them into the room, sitting heavily in the space between the investigators and the family. Finally, the story began. Not as a dramatic reveal, not as a list of horrific details, but as the truth, told slowly, respectfully, piece by painful piece. They explained how the case had gone cold, how the desert had hidden its secrets, how the evidence collected in 1975 had seemed meaningless for so long, how technology, decades later, had breathed new life into it. The Perez family listened in stillness, bracing themselves with every word. Then came the name, Raymond Holt. Not a stranger passing through, not a distant drifter, but a man who had lived within walking distance of their home. A man who had watched their children walk to school. A man whose presence had blended into the quiet fabric of Arroyo Verde. It hit the family with a shock that felt strangely familiar. The realization that someone they had seen, someone who may have nodded at them in passing, someone who had been part of the same town, had taken everything from them in one unthinkable moment. The investigators described the evidence: the DNA on the ribbon, the button found in the shed, the soil matching the dried riverbed, the hand-drawn doodles from a notebook page now cracked and faded with time. And then they explained the reconstructed timeline, the abduction, the movement, the likely sequence of events. They told the story with care, sparing unnecessary detail, while honoring the need for truth. As the family listened, decades of unanswered questions finally found shape. Decades of wandering thoughts finally found direction. Decades of nightmares finally found an ending. But the truth came with a weight, a quiet, aching weight that pressed down on the room like the desert heat outside. Clara had been taken quickly, quietly, without pain lasting long, a small mercy hidden inside a tragedy that had defined a lifetime. The Perez family absorbed the information slowly. For some, the truth brought closure, a sense of finality after years of imagining the worst. The not knowing had been its own kind of torment, an endless loop of possibilities. Now, the endless questions had stilled. For others, the truth was a reopening of wounds they had spent decades trying to close. Knowing who had taken Clara did not erase the pain of losing her. It did not return the years stolen from their family. It did not bring back the little girl they had once held, or the future she had been denied. But it did bring something the family never expected to feel: relief. Relief that Clara had not suffered for years. Relief that she had not been trafficked, or lost in the wilderness, or hidden by strangers. Relief that the desert had not swallowed her alive. She had been stolen by a man who acted quickly, destructively, and alone. And then she was gone. It was heartbreak with boundaries, sorrow with edges, the kind of loss that could finally be understood, even if it could never be undone. At the end of the meeting, investigators placed the red ribbon gently on the table. Its color had faded to a dusty pink. Its edges had frayed with time. But even after half a lifetime, it still carried the memory of the little girl who wore it. The room went quiet again. For a moment, time seemed to fold. The past and the present aligned, and Clara, though gone, felt close, closer than she had been since that warm spring morning in 1975. The Perez family left with answers they never expected to receive. Some walked out with trembling hands. Others walked out with silent tears. All walked out carrying both closure and sorrow in equal measure. Arroyo Verde would never be the same. But now, after nearly 50 years, the truth had finally been spoken. The silence had finally broken, and Clara's story was no longer trapped in the desert's shadows. It was known. It was understood. It was hers again. The truth about Clara Perez had finally reached the people who had waited longest to hear it. But outside the quiet meeting room, where the Perez family learned what happened to her, the world still didn't know. For nearly 50 years, Clara's disappearance had been a ghost story whispered through Arroyo Verde. a mystery that haunted the town like a lingering shadow. Now, the time had come to share it. The announcement began quietly, with a simple message sent to local media outlets. A major cold case from 1975 had been solved. No names, no details, just enough to ignite curiosity and reopen wounds the town had spent decades trying to close. By morning, news vans rolled into Arroyo Verde, tires crunching against gravel, their antennas rising like metal thorns against the pale desert sky. Reporters stepped out, adjusting cameras, brushing dust from their clothes, preparing for the kind of story rarely told in towns this small, one that reached back into history and pulled tragedy into the present. The press conference was held outside the sheriff's department, under a striped awning that fluttered gently in the warm wind. The desert sun cast long shadows across the concrete. Residents gathered at a distance, some leaning against their trucks, arms crossed, others clutching faded newspaper clippings that had yellowed over decades. Clara's missing poster, reprinted on crisp white paper, hung from a board behind the podium. Her small face, frozen in time, looked out at the crowd with quiet innocence. The image had traveled through generations untouched, a reminder of a moment the town had never truly escaped. When officials stepped up to the microphones, a hush fell over the crowd. The truth came slowly, measured in careful sentences. They spoke of new forensic technology, of breakthroughs unimaginable in 1975, of silent evidence preserved longer than anyone expected, of DNA recovered from the ribbon, of the storage shed, of the soil analysis, of a name long hidden in the background of the town's past. Raymond Holt, a man who had lived among them, a man who had walked the same streets, a man they had passed in the grocery store, nodded to on sidewalks, waved at as he repaired fences. A man who died decades ago with a secret so dark it would shake the entire community. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the truth settled in. The idea that Holt, quiet, unassuming, forgettable Holt, had been capable of such a crime seemed impossible. And yet, impossibility was always the shield that predators hid behind. Officials explained the reconstructed timeline, the evidence that connected Holt to the abduction, the certainty of his involvement despite his passing. They shared only what was necessary, only what honored Clara's memory, but the weight of the details left the town in stunned silence. For the first time in nearly half a century, the case of Clara Perez had an ending. Not the ending anyone wanted, not the ending anyone imagined, but the truth nonetheless. Reporters scribbled notes with wide eyes, capturing every word. Cameras zoomed in on the ribbon, displayed in a protective casing for the first time since it was collected from the playground. It no longer looked like a simple child's accessory. It looked like a relic, a piece of history, the fragile key to unraveling a mystery that once seemed unsolvable. As the sheriff spoke, people in the crowd wept openly, some in relief, some in grief, some because the truth had been buried so long that hearing it felt overwhelming, like digging up a memory they weren't ready to face. Older residents remembered the search parties, the helicopters, the endless calls for volunteers. They remembered the shock, the fear, the anger, the quiet funerals of hope held in their hearts. Younger residents, who weren't even alive in 1975, listened as if witnessing the end of a legend that had defined the town long before they were born. Arroyo Verde had carried Clara's disappearance like an unhealed wound. Now, for the first time, the wound had a scar, painful but closed. After the conference ended, people lingered. They stood in small groups, murmuring about Holt, about the investigation, about the technology that had solved what once felt unsolvable. Some walked away slowly, as if unsure how to return to their routines after hearing the truth they'd waited all their lives to know. Others approached the display case holding Clara's ribbon, staring at it with reverence. It was strange how such a small object had become so monumental. A child's ribbon, tender, delicate, innocently placed in her hair, had survived dust, time, heat, and darkness. It had survived the decades that Clara herself could not, and now it had brought justice. In the days following the announcement, the story spread across the state. Newspapers ran headlines: "Cold case solved after 48 years. DNA links, local man to 1975 disappearance. Arroyo Verde finds answers." But beneath the headlines, beneath the relief, beneath the closure, the town felt something deeper, something solemn. They hadn't just solved a mystery, they had laid a ghost to rest. For decades, Clara's story had been spoken like a warning, a cautionary tale whispered among parents and told to children who never knew her. Now it had a final chapter, one written with evidence, not fear. The sheriff's department officially closed the case file. The red ink stamp, closed, landed heavily on the paper, but the meaning went far beyond bureaucratic finality. It meant that Clara's name no longer floated in limbo. It meant that the question, "What happened to her?" no longer echoed unanswered. It meant that the town could finally breathe. As dusk settled over Arroyo Verde later that evening, a soft glow touched the playground where Clara had once stood. The swings creaked in the wind, the fence rattled gently, and the sand, still warm from the sun, seemed to hold the memory of a little girl whose story had shaped generations. The case was closed, but Clara's presence remained, woven into the quiet desert air, into the lives she left behind, into the hearts of a town that had spent nearly 50 years searching for her. The truth was finally known. The darkness had finally lifted. And after a lifetime of unanswered questions, Clara Perez, forever 5 years old, finally had peace. For nearly half a century, the disappearance of 5-year-old Clara Perez lingered like a shadow stretching across the desert floor, long, silent, and ever-present. Her story drifted through generations, whispered through classrooms, retold at dinner tables, and carried quietly in the hearts of everyone who ever searched for her. Now, with the truth finally revealed, Arroyo Verde began to feel its weight lift. Not erased, never erased, but softened. The wound that once split the town had closed into a scar, tender yet no longer open. For the first time since 1975, life moved forward with clarity instead of questions. In the weeks after the case closure, something remarkable happened. Townspeople began visiting the old school playground, not in fear, but in remembrance. Some brought flowers. Others placed small stones on the fence line, marking a path that symbolized Clara's last known steps. Children, too young to understand the past, played nearby, their laughter weaving hope back into the air. The playground had been a place of loss. Now it became a place of tribute. A local teacher advocated for a memorial bench to honor Clara, something subtle yet permanent, something that would remind future generations that her story mattered. Within months, the bench was built, sanded smooth, and installed beneath the only tree that cast shade over the playground. A small plaque rested on the side, engraved gently, "In memory of Clara Perez, forever loved Forever 5. No dramatic ceremony was held. No crowds, no cameras. Just a quiet morning where the desert wind rustled leaves overhead and sunlight pooled softly across the sand, almost as if Clara herself were watching. Across town, the Perez family found themselves living in a strange new reality. They had answers. They had closure. But closure does not erase grief. It only gives it shape. Their grief became something they could finally hold instead of something that held them. They framed the red ribbon, the single survivor of that tragic day, and placed it on a shelf beside Clara's childhood drawings. It wasn't a symbol of what was taken from them, but of what had finally been returned: the truth. The cold case unit archived everything meticulously. Clara's files were scanned, preserved, and stored with the highest care, not to be reopened, but to be remembered. Investigators who had once stared into the void of the unknown now felt a sense of completion, the rare kind that only comes when the past finally speaks. But the story didn't end with Clara, not truly. Her case became a catalyst for broader change. The state expanded its cold case funding. Older evidence from dozens of other cases was scheduled for retesting. Clara's name became the quiet push behind advancements that would help countless families still trapped in uncertainty. Her story, once defined by silence, now carried echoes of hope. As the years moved on, Arroyo Verde slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The desert winds continued to sweep across the plains, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant rain. The sun rose and fell over the same mesas that had witnessed a tragedy so long ago. But something was different now. The town no longer felt haunted. Children played freely on the swings again. Parents watched with vigilance, but without the paralyzing fear that once gripped the community. The land felt lighter, as though it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for decades. Near the playground fence, where Clara had last stood, a small set of footprints sometimes appeared in the sand. Maybe from neighborhood children, maybe from wind patterns, maybe just coincidence. But those who believed in signs liked to think they meant something more: the lingering presence of a child who never got to grow up, but who would always be part of the town that loved her. On warm evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the desert gold, the bench beneath the tree glowed softly in the fading light. It became the quiet heart of the playground, a symbol of innocence, loss, remembrance, and ultimately peace. Clara Perez had been missing for nearly 50 years, but she was never forgotten. And now, at last, she was no longer lost. Her name lived on not as a mystery, but as a memory, not as a question, but as an answer, not in shadow, but in sunlight. The truth had come. The silence had lifted. And the little girl with the red ribbon, Forever 5, finally rested in the place where she belonged, home.